And last Wednesday, there was a meeting that included Army generals and intelligence officials where they discussed a plan to, if necessary, do voter fraud to push General Prabowo over the 50% threshold he will need in order to win in tomorrow's election. A very disgusting public relations campaign, which portrays this notorious general as a gemoy, a fat, adorable cartoon character.
Indonesia, the scene of two of the 20th century's epic slaughters, may be on the verge of a return to army rule at the hands of its most notorious general. General Prabowo Subianto, a longtime U.S. protege implicated in the country's massacres, once mused about becoming a fascist dictator and is now a serious threat to assume the presidency. Those are the opening two paragraphs of a new article in The Intercept by the award-winning journalist Alan Nairn, who spent decades covering Indonesia and the country it occupied for a quarter of a century, East Timor. Alan is joining us now from Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, ahead of Wednesday's election in Indonesia. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Alan. Why don't you start off by just laying out the scene of what's about to happen tomorrow and who exactly Prabowo is?
Well, General Prabowo is the most notorious massacre general in Indonesia, and he's also the general who was closest to the U.S. as he was carrying out his mass killings, abductions of activists, and systematic tortures. He was also the son-in-law of the former dictator of Indonesia, General Suharto. Prabowo described himself to me as the American's fair-haired boy. He mused about becoming a fascist dictator. He told me Indonesia is not ready for democracy. And he described in detail how he received training from the U.S. at Fort Benning and Fort Bragg, how when in 1998 Suharto was falling, and Prabowo was in the process of kidnapping activists, he was in regular consultation with the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. In fact, Prabowo told me that he reported to the U.S. DIA at least once a week. He also described how under a Pentagon program known as JCET, Joint Combined Exchange and Training, General Prabowo, brought fully armed troops into Indonesia on at least 41 occasions. And Pentagon documents back up Prabowo's account. According to the general and those Pentagon documents, while the U.S. troops were in Indonesia, after, as the Pentagon put it, Prabowo opened the door to them, they started doing reconnaissance and making plans, contingency plans, for a possible future U.S. invasion of Indonesia, as Prabowo put it to me, for the invasion contingency. So these armed U.S. troops, which Prabowo brought in to Java and Sumatra and other places in Indonesia, were laying the groundwork for a future U.S. invasion if the U.S. chose to do that. This is particularly interesting since Prabowo styles himself, as he's running for president now, as a nationalist. And he attacks anyone who opposes him as an antek asing, a foreign lackey, when in fact he is the one who was closest to the U.S., who was helping the U.S. plan for an invasion, and who in more recent years helped to kill a workers' rights lawsuit against Freeport-McMoran, the American mining giant, which is stripping the hills and forests of de facto occupied West Papua. And he is the general, most importantly, who led many of the massacres in East Timor after the Indonesian army invaded with the green light from President Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger. In one case, in the village of Kraras, Prabowo and his forces killed hundreds of fleeing civilians. He later was involved in other massacres and directing assassinations of political activists in Aceh and West Papua. And now he may be on the verge of assuming the presidency. He's tried for many years to seize power. He's tried multiple coup attempts. But this time he has the backing of the incumbent government, the incumbent civilian president, Joko Widodo, Jokowi, and the state apparatus is being put behind General Prabowo. The army and police are going out and intimidating poor people at the neighborhood level, telling them that if they don't vote for Prabowo, the authorities will know about it and they'll be in trouble. People are being threatened with poor people are being threatened with having their government rations of rice and cooking oil cut off if they don't vote for Prabowo. Academics who recently spoke out against this use of state power to push this general into office are now being visited and intimidated by the police. And last Wednesday, there was a meeting that included Army generals and intelligence officials, where they discussed a plan to, if necessary, do voter fraud to push General Prabowo over the 50% threshold he will need in order to win in tomorrow's election. It's a three-candidate election, and if he gets over the 50% threshold and gets a sufficient number of votes in the provinces outside Java, he will automatically become the president-elect. And the plan that was discussed at that meeting among those senior military and intelligence officials was that there was an existing plan to do fraud, if necessary, to push the general over that threshold and impose him on Indonesia as their new president, really their new ruler.
Alan, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that the incumbent president, Joko Widodo, is backing Prabowo. How do you explain this change since he defeated the general in two previous elections and once talked about actually holding him on trial for war crimes?
Right. It's a very important question, and it has a lot of Indonesians outraged. When Jokowi defeated Prabowo the first time around in 2014, he, the incumbent president, the civilian Jokowi, had the support of many massacre survivors and human rights activists. And they did, internally, the Jokowi government did talk about putting General Prabowo and other generals like General Wiranto and General Hendro Priyono on trial for war crimes. I've been publicly calling for that for years, and also calling for their U.S. sponsors to be tried for war crimes. And in fact, in the early years of the Jokowi administration, I met with some of his advisors in the palace and discussed this with them. And what they kept saying was, yes, but it will take time. This is very dangerous. We have to go slowly. But they said that that was the direction they were moving in. However, they never got there. They never even attempted to stage the trials. And then in 2019, after Jokowi defeated General Prabowo for the second time, Prabowo staged the latest of his many coup attempts by backing street riots that involved mass looting and burning in Jakarta. And it was at that point that President Jokowi said enough. He couldn't take it anymore. And according to intermediaries from both sides, from both the Prabowo and the Jokowi side, Jokowi then decided to bring Prabowo into the tent in the hope that if he did that, if he brought him inside the government, that would put an end to the coup threats and the incited street riots. And in fact, it did. He brought Prabowo in. He made him Minister of Defense. And the two then grew close. Their interests coincided. Jokowi, the president, became increasingly wealthy. Prabowo backed the Indonesian military policy of killing civilians in de facto occupied West Papua, where there is strong sentiment for independence. And this time around, when this next round of elections was coming up, the incumbent civilian president Jokowi decided he wanted to try to extend his own term, even though there's a two-term limit, as in the United States. He looked into options for maybe getting a third term or maybe postponing the elections, but he wasn't able to pull those off. So he made a deal with General Prabowo, with this massacre general, who was responsible for the slaughter of thousands and thousands of civilians across Indonesia and in occupied East Timor. President Jokowi made a deal to back him